Good afternoon in Western Europe, I guess. Good morning in the Northern American and Southern American hemispheres. Good night to Asia. My name is Monica Weber-Fahr. I am the moderator of this session that we're all joining here together that is going to reflect on the first global survey of water values, to figure out why a survey like that made sense, why it was put together, what the implications are for those of us working on water policies or on operational choices in regard to water in corporate settings or in other organizations, and to see whether we can take these findings forward somewhere. I have with me here in this session a great group of folks who've been spending some time not only thinking and researching about values of water, but also applying the concept in various forms of their daily work, including on programs that have contributed to significant changes in water organizations' performance. And I'll introduce them in a moment, but in starting, I would like to introduce first Martin Gishler from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Martin, can you tell me why you were even starting with a valuing water or a water value survey? We can't hear you, Martin.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. Let me start big picture. Society faces very complex and simultaneous transitions because of climate change, because of biodiversity loss in the energy domain, in the ecosystems domain, in the industry, in the urban space, etc. And in all these transitions, water is a factor. It's an enabler or it's a constraint. And, that means endless interdependencies and endless choices to be made. And therefore also endless values involved. And I think against that background, the high-level panel on water in 2016 was convened, and our Prime Minister was a member of that. And in their report that came out in 2018, they called for the world to manage, to understand, value, and manage water better. And that is a great high-level statement, but what does it really mean in practice? Regarding valuing, the panel said, 5 things, 5 principles, and basically recognizing different values, reconciling them, protecting the sources, empowering, and innovating. I mean, this is very sort of condensed, but how do you do that? And how does that inspire change to go through these transitions that we are facing in individuals, in organizations, and in society at large? And how do they interrelate? Does it begin with one person and then snowballs, or does it begin in an organization? And so we didn't know that. So that's why we initiated the Valuing Water initiative in 2019 to operationalize those 5 principles and to understand and facilitate change processes from the negative water outcomes that we see, the persistent inequalities, pollution, depletion, to the positive outcomes of a water secure world for all. And we employ a values lens. And I often, I don't see much when I take it off, but does this, if you would see this as a values lens, what do you see when you put it on? Does it reveal what drives behavior, what drives decisions, what drives policy? And so in this year's theme of Water Week, seeing the unseen, valuing water, I think that the theme could not be better for this session. So
thank you. So we're getting at the point where you're saying as you want to have us take a closer look at values because they can maybe show us something on decision making that we don't see. Now, we've got some nearly 50 people participating in this session, and we would like to invite you all to tell us, before we even getting into further discussion, why you are participating in this session. Eva, could you run the survey? You should all now see on your screens the question that says, why are you participating in this session? And we're asking you to choose one of 4 options, I think. I don't see it right now. There we go. You see I have 4 options. So if you could click on those. The first one is you're interested in the survey. You could also say field level leadership, which is one of the programs that we're going to feature here in this session as something that uses personal values to drive changes in organizations that deal with water and with other common goods. You could also say that you're keen to hear and discuss more about how values influence decision making, or you might be here by accident. So far, I haven't seen many people clicking that one on. We're going to give you a couple of more minutes to tell us why you're here. And then, okay, let me see that I get that properly.
And for those searching for where to find where you can fit in the polls, on the page, so actually on the meeting details where you went to open it, here next to your chat, you have polls which you can fit in the first one. And for the rest of the polls, they will be found in the same place.
So there is this nice little thing that says poll exactly, where you can enter your vote right now. Okay, so can you show us where we have landed with that first series of questions, Aifha?
Yeah, so I hope it's up on the screen. So the majority is definitely, I'm keen to hear and discuss about how values influence decision making. And the second, very close, is I'm interested in the value in water survey, with field level leadership in 3rd place.
Well,
and
that's good to know, because it means many of you don't actually know yet what it is. So, and it's also great to see how you're really interested in the subject matter of figuring out how values can drive decisions. So now let's get to the second question we have to you. And that is a question that's a bit more personal. And it is, what do you personally think of mostly when you see the term water values? It's been all over the place, as Martin has said correctly. It's part of the Stockholm Water Week's gathering to discuss about values, water values, valuing water. The question is primarily, what do you think about when you see that term? Do you think about the dollar value of water, the price? Do you think about how valuable water is as a scarce resource, what its many functions? Do you think how to prioritize? Or does the cultural value come to your mind first? Or just generally values driving decisions? The moment I can see the cultural values heading our set of questions, I think. Do I see that right? Hang on, it's kind of small for me. I need to get this bigger.
At the moment, it's equal between how valuable water is as a scarce resource and we don't have enough of, and the many different functions which water serves and how these different functions get prioritized. At 21% is the cultural and personal value of water, and at 14% the dollar value of water, so the price.
So it's really interesting, because when you know when you talk to people about valuing water, what it means for you, primarily when you hear it, that it really, for most people, the word value resonates with a bigger set of paradigms, driving decisions and creating a sense of appreciation, perhaps even if you're considering the cultural value. Now, this is a great moment to go over because over to our next speakers, Christopher Schultz and Lucas Wolfe. Christopher is with Cambridge University and Lucas with Bath University. They actually had to ask a lot of questions related to water values when they were running the survey. Christopher, Lucas, can you tell us about the survey, what you were trying to find, and what you actually ended up finding? Over to you, Christoph.
Thank you so much, Monica, and also to Martin. And I think you have already given a really good background to why we did this survey. How does it matter? What is the policy relevance of it? But also what can we learn from discussing values? So I would like to move to the next slide already, which gives a bit of a background. How did this survey work? Who did fill it out? So this was an online survey that we did over the last year with a lot of input from water professionals, people who take decisions on water in one way or another. And as you can see, we had a global reach. We were trying to get views from people on all continents. We have a slight bias towards Europe and Latin America and Africa. But nevertheless, we had responses from people working in the water sector or taking decisions about water all around the world. So our survey was also available in several world languages to facilitate having that global perspective. As you can see, we had quite a nice balance between male and female, a good age range. Maybe we could have had more responses from younger people. And interestingly enough, we had a lot of responses from very senior people, which is unusual for a survey, but was an interesting surprise to us. I should also note the survey is still available under that link that you can see here, which is also in the chat. So if you would like to take it, you can still do so. But for now, we will be presenting the results from the responses we have got so far, which are a few hundred. Next slide, please. This is the theoretical background that we used to design the survey, and I don't want to go into too much detail. It's a bit too much to cover in a brief presentation. But the key message here is that when we talk about what are values, how do they matter for valuing water, people have really quite different understandings of the term value. So some people, can you still see the slides? Because I cannot see them anymore. Yeah, there they are again. So we have on the top left the term fundamental values. So these are sort of our personal guiding principles. And some people, when they think about how do values influence decisions, they think about this personal level. What are the personal principles that guide me in my life, but also in my work? But more commonly, and also I was also seeing the poll just now, people tend to think of water values. So to the bottom left, what are the values that water has? And we also looked at a third category here in the middle, the governance-related values, which are the principles that may guide how we take decisions about water. And this may become clearer in the upcoming slides. But for now, I want to hand over to Lucas, who will talk a bit more about what fundamental values or personal values mean and how they may influence decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to say a bit more about fundamental values, which we looked at from a psychological perspective. So as Christopher said, these are more personal values. They guide people's lives, their life guiding principles. In other words, they're abstract, trans-situational goals that, for example, predict our opinions or our behaviors. And so one of the most, or actually the most well-established theory in psychology for values has been developed by Schultz. And Schultz has distinguished or identified various different types of values that you can see here on the right side. Some of those values are, for example, helpfulness or freedom, and people attach importance to these values, and they differ in how important they find these values. For the present project, we looked at the higher order value types, which are on the outside of the circle. So there are 4 higher order value types. You can see, for example, self-transcendence on the top right, which are values, for example, as helpfulness, loyalty, or protecting the environment. And they generally capture other-orientedness or preference for prioritizing the common good, for example. And these self-transcendence values are contrasted with self-enhancement values, which you can see on the bottom left, which are more self-oriented values such as achievement or power. Orthogonal to that dimension is the openness to change versus conservation dimension, where openness to change values are, for example, freedom or creativity, and conservation values are tradition or security. And as you can see, or you can hopefully get some kind of idea of, there are conflicts between these values to some extent. So to the extent that people are more other-oriented, so higher in self-transcendence values, they tend to be somewhat lower in self-enhancement or self-oriented values. And the same is true for openness and conservation. And this is also something we expected to see in our present survey, and you will see in our results in a second. And I head back over to Christopher and the next slide.
Yeah, again, thinking back of the overview that I showed earlier, we had 3 types of values, the fundamental ones that Lucas covered just now, but we also have the values of water. And maybe this overview here is less surprising to you, thinking, well, what are the values of water and how could we classify them? And what were the survey results there? So we can put them into 3 broad categories of economic values. So things like irrigation, hydropower, those are economic values of water. We could think of them in terms of the value for ecosystems, for the environment. So is a river an ecosystem for aquatic species and so on. And we could also think of the value of water as important for culture. So maintaining traditions. There's a lot of traditions around the world that are directly related to water. Now moving next. Perhaps the more interesting and new finding for us was about the values that underpin water governance, also from a research perspective that hasn't been studied very much. And in our survey, we found that people subscribed to 1 of 2 major perspectives, or they saw 2 major ways how we should design water governance. So one, we called it the efficiency perspective, where you sort of think, well, water governance needs to be quick, effective, not use too much money, not waste money. I think everyone can relate to that. But that was sort of opposed to the social justice perspective, where you would want everyone to participate, everyone to have a say, even if that means things are slower and so on. And on the next slide, we can see a little bit how this does look like in our data. So we have individual values here. Every dot is 1 value, so to speak, of a governance-related value. And you can see on the top left all these efficiency values clustered together, and to the bottom right, all the social justice kind of values clustered together. So really we found these 2 dominant perspectives. What makes good water governance? One of the 2, or both of them contribute to good water governance, but they are clearly different.
Christopher, could you just say what's on the horizontal axis, because one can't really see that?
Yes, maybe I should allow Lucas to speak on that. But
on the horizon, so the axes are it's a bit technical, where we're talking here about loadings, basically. So to what extent or how important is each individual value item that you can see on the screen for the respective factor, if that makes sense. So for example, you can see competition on the very top left is the most important item for that particular factor. So it's most, or efficiency is mostly captured by competition, and to a lesser extent by the others that you can see that are somewhat lower. And the same is true for the horizontal axis. So social justice is the highest item loading on the social justice component, which makes sense, of course. Accountability is the lowest one, but still somewhat features into it. So somewhat it's how do these items fit into the factors, basically.
So it's kind of the strongest common denominator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so there are 2 that are strong common denominators, and you're able to cluster these things along, all the many values have a strong common denominator on efficiency, and then all other group has a strong common denominator on social justice.
That's it. It's basically a measure of their indicators. So how well do they indicate the respective factor? That's it. Yeah.
Next slide, please. So the same statistical technique that you just saw, we also used it to look at water policy preferences. So what are strategic priorities for water policy? Because we didn't just want to look at values in isolation. We wanted to know, well, how does this matter for water policy? What are the links there? And to be able to do so, we asked respondents quite a lot of questions about their preferences on water policy at quite a high level. Again, the result was that we found 3 perspectives. So in the previous slide, you saw 2. Now imagine 3 different consistent perspectives on water policy, was what the data showed to us. The first one of these 3, we called it the mastering nature perspective on water management and policy. So these were a lot of statements that engineering is important. Maybe in the 60s and 70s, it was quite common to think, well, if we need to manage water, we need to build a dam, we need to use concrete, we need to channel water, all of these physical interventions sort of clustered together. The second perspective is what we call the market-based water management perspective or paradigm. So there was a strong consistency that we should be using money, payments, charges, water markets to solve our water problems. Again, it may relate to the Dublin Principles in 1992, where it was first stated that water is an economic good. Finally, we have a third perspective, which we call the working with nature perspective. So that's perhaps a more recent thing where everyone says, well, we need to use ecosystem services, we need to work with nature rather than against it to solve water management problems. A typical example for that might be natural flood management, where you say we no longer put water into a channel. We work with nature rather than against to manage water. And Lucas will say a bit more how these 3 distinct perspectives are linked to people's values.
Yeah, thank you. Can you click on next, please? Thanks. So yeah, as Christopher said, we looked at how the values that Christopher talked about before, how those 3 different value frameworks relate to those policy preferences that we've identified as well. So you can see the fundamental values, governance-related values, and water values, and you can see the 3 policies we've identified, or the types of policies we've identified. First of all, what was interesting was that the first 2 types of policies, so mastering nature and market-based policies, tended to be associated with very similar pattern of values. So we find that people who prioritize self-enhancement values, more self-oriented values such as achievement or power, tended to have a greater preference for these kind of policies. The same goes for efficiency, governance-related values, and seeing greater economic uses in water. All of these greater preferences or greater prioritization of these values, self-enhancement, efficiency, and economic uses, tended to be related to greater preferences for mastering nature and market-based policies. Then very different from that, we found for working with nature that people have a greater priority for self-transcendence values. So for example, values that are interested in the common good, for example, helpfulness or protecting the environment, for example. People will prioritize these values and had a greater preference for working with nature. The same was true for social justice, governance-related values, and seeing greater environmental uses of water. All of these predicted a greater preference for working with nature. So if you remember from when I introduced the fundamental values earlier, there are these motivational conflicts in values, and one of them was self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. And you can see these play out as well here in this case, where quite opposing patterns of values predict these different water policy features.
Lucas, before we go to the next slide, just one question. Is it possible that these conflicts play out in one person, or does one tend to, with one's value cluster, gravitate into one group, into these preferences for a mastering nature solution or a market-based solution or a working with nature solution?
That's a really good question. It's not so much here that we really have clusters of people. So we're not grouping people into different categories. And this is type A, and they're very different from type B. But we all have self-enhancement values. They're important. They're good as well. They help us, have greater achievement in life, for example. And we have self-transcendence values. So perhaps depending on the situation, we might favor self-transcendence values or self-enhancement values. And it's very much within the person that these play out, and these conflicts play out. So we we might feel both at the same time and might have a preference for one policy over the other in different situations. So very good question. One thing I do want to mention, what was interesting as well was in the mastering nature policy, we also found conservation values predict greater preferences for these, which might indicate that this is a more traditional way of looking at policy. So mastering nature is traditionally important and might explain that link. What I find interesting, just as a quick takeaway from this, is that this is very much in line with what we expected. So it was good to confirm these interrelations between value frameworks, but it's also very interesting that we do find it in linking a very well-established theory, such as the fundamental values framework, with frameworks that we've identified in this research, which kind of underscores the findings that we've made, that they make sense and they can be connected to a well-established theory. And I'll hand back over to Christopher for the final slide.
And Christopher, you've got about 10 seconds.
Okay, I'll be quick in that case. I think the first takeaway message is clear. When we talk about values, let's be clear. What are we talking about? Are we talking about personal values or values of water? That's really the first thing I would recommend. The second one, I think, needs no explanation. Values influence how we take decisions. This is clearly something shown in our survey findings as well. We can find this values footprint in people's attitudes towards water policies and decisions. And maybe you recognize yourself in one of these three perspectives from the previous slide.
And then there's a number of policy implications that you're suggesting here that I'm not going to let you discuss, because we're going to do that in a moment with a bunch of people who are taking such policy decisions. But it would be great if we can now hear from our audience. We're now at some 70 participants, but just as a teaser, we will have right after your voting or polling, I'm going to turn to someone whom I think of as a representative of the efficiency component. Pablo Bericiatura, a former state secretary in the Ministry of Infrastructure in Argentina, responsible for water, now the chair of the Global Water Partnership, and Maitri Das, a manager in the World Bank's Urban Land and Disaster Risk Management group, who has a lifelong work on social justice. So we're going to have a little bit of an interesting discussion and debate on how that plays out from the efficiency component versus the social justice component in perspectives. But before we go there, I'd like to invite you all to tell us, number one is, we've just looked at these values archetypes. And it would be great to hear from you where you see these play out in terms of decisions, mostly at the individual level, at the community level, in organizations, in policy choices or political decision-making, in media, in the academic space. So have you seen these archetypes play out, you know, in individual people that you see, or in communities, etc.? If you could bring up the poll piece again. And for those of you who weren't here earlier, when you're on your Water Week page, I can see most people have figured out how to do that. There's a thing where you can click on polls, and there you will see the question on where do you see the values archetypes play out. And we'd like to hear from you and see where you see these things play out mostly. And I'm quite interested to see that actually people see them play out in individuals. I had thought so too, but my guess had been most of you would think it's in the policy choices. But in fact, sometimes one, in my view, you meet somebody, you debate, and you say, okay, well, that's a category, this archetype, that's a category, that archetype person, which of course is something that we should probably try to avoid so as to still remain open, but it can help us maybe in uncovering values that we can connect, but we'll hear more about that in a moment. So that's an interesting, so mostly in policy choices, not so much in organizations. That's also something maybe either Maitri or Pablo, you want to comment on it, but we'll definitely hear about it when we'll talk about FLL, the field level leadership work, because that functions at the organizational level. and does look at working with these archetypes in a very different and new way. So let's go to the second question that we had for you all, which is, do you yourself identify with one of the archetypes? And if so, with which? So type 1, just for your, to jog your memory, was the mastering nature archetype. Type 2 was the market-based archetype. Type 3, the working with nature archetype. And 4, you could say, well, my value system is kind of all over the place, or totally different, it's not in here. So again, type 1 is mastering nature. Type 2 is market-based in terms of solutions. And type 3 is working with nature. And 4 is you're nowhere on that scale. Okay, so it seems we have a lot of working with nature people here. And from what I can also see, there's no mastering nature, and 1 or 2 very lonely market-based people. But let's give you a little bit more time. Maybe the market-based people are at some other conference, not at the Stockholm-based World Water Week. But okay, well, we've got one person that is, well, a few people perhaps who are a bit outside of this. Any further add-ons here that you want to do some voting for? But that means now for Pablo and Maitre, just that you're aware, you have a lot of people here in that group that are from the working with nature archetype, and just 1 or 2 or 3 who are from the type 1 side, which is the mastering nature, and a few more, but not too many either, who come from the marketing based. Okay, look, it keeps changing. But yeah, the dominance for the working with nature does stay. So with that, thank you for telling us who you are in the audience, where you're falling into terms of archetypes, and hopefully we can challenge your own thinking and together think about how to make these values perspective that you bring to policy making, how we can make these work when working with others who come from different value systems and structures. Maitre and Pablo, and maybe we can do a ladies first piece here. Maitre, when you reflect on the survey's findings, in your view and having worked with many institutions, what do these findings say about the political economy of decision-making on water? Any perspectives?
Thank you so much, Monica, and real pleasure to be here and to see the audience's response as well. You know, I'm going to say something a little more provocative than you probably intended for me to say. And I found that the results of the survey actually did not address the political economy side of it, which is that this is a theoretical depiction of how people respond. What happens on the ground is actually quite different. And what happens on the ground is that very often values are not aligned. So there is often a clash of values, and you know, you can think about it at the individual level, but in fact, when you look at organizations, you've got to think about a collective. And the collective is a very diverse and a very, very heterogeneous collective. And that leads to all kinds of pushes and pulls as far as the ways in which values play out in the collective, in an organization, within an institution. I can go on a little bit more, but I just want to end this round by saying that, which does not mean that a value-based decision making cannot take place. It can, as long as we are aware of the heterogeneity of the collective, and as long as we learn from the ways in which this has been done in various different contexts that I can talk a bit more about as you give me time next round, Monica. Back to you.
Thank you. But listening to what you're saying, and let me throw this on to Pablo, and maybe if you want to have a comeback, Maitre, wouldn't you say from a political economy perspective that all decisions are always values driven, only that not all, you know, different values get the upper hand for different reasons? And as you say, groups are heterogeneous. Particular entities are not speaking with one voice. And it depends on different factors, not necessarily to do with values, which values perspective goes further. Pablo, what do you say about the political economy dimension of values-based decision-making? Pablo?
I think this is a very challenging discussion in a way, because to my understanding, we all have our own values, and they change with time and with knowledge. When we experience reality, we change typically our values. Now, the key point here is how do we build a collective system, an intelligence that is able to manage the environment in a sustainable fashion. So if we think about that, then we will end up in governance. And the key issue here is, for me, the question is, how do you fit the values, the different values within a governance model that is efficient, that changes the reality? And then a top level on top of that, and I hope I'm not confusing everybody, is politics. Because at the end of the day, we have our own values, but there is a major game, which is politics, which plays with our values in decisions. So when I saw the results of the people now in our audience, I saw that they identified both the political policies, the policies are reflecting the values, and also their individual values. So these are the two arenas for the discussion, I think. So I am very respectful on any kind of individual value, but for me, the key question is governance. And for that, I wanted to share, and if you allowed me, I will now, very briefly, a practical experience that I was in charge in Argentina. And this is a study, a project we did for trying to improve the water governance in Argentina. This is with the OECD and also including some international advisors. And what we found is that one of the key points is to give the opportunity for the different stakeholders to interact and to know each other and to develop trust. And the other key point is to have information, data, because you have many values that actually change whenever you see real information. I know it's a very broad issue, but I wanted to share this with you.
Thank you. And I think if I can invite Maitri for a response on this one. Maitri, you've been saying groups are heterogeneous. There are many different values that are playing out in there. From that perspective, taking a values-based structure for decision-making might not help. But from what I hear from Pablo is if you create space for people to interact based on their values and maybe even talk about them to each other, so that they have not only data, say, on water levels or on quality, but also data on each other, that this may shift decision-making as it builds trust. Any views on your end on this, Maitri?
Sure. I think I actually do agree with what Pablo has said, is that it does ultimately boil down about the structures of decision-making. And we can learn a lot from mission-driven organizations, which are both non-government as well as government. People tend to think that mission-driven organizations tend to be only non-governmental organizations. I want to actually put forth the idea that in fact, there are a lot of state actors, state-sponsored organizations that are values-based. And values can be values you agree with, and they can be values you don't agree with. And as you know, I am very respectful of people's individual values, but then there are some organizations that tend to espouse values that you don't necessarily agree with, in which case you don't really want to be part of that organization. And that often happens where people don't want to be part of a certain mission that an organization is espousing. Now, to get back to the fact that let's assume that a values-based decision-making is a positive thing. Let's assume for a minute that values are universally positive. We know that that's not the case. We know that there is a specificity, a cultural relativism in values, and there's a universalism in values. And we saw a bit of that in the wheel that Lucas and Chris showed us. But the fact is this, that there is an opportunity and there is a possibility for developing organizations, institutions that are values-based, and let's say positive values-based, positive as in around issues of equity and efficiency. So you can have both. It's a trade-off. It's often a trade-off. Efficiency and equity are often a trade-off, but they don't always have to be. There can be a balance between equity and efficiency. And there are ways in which organizations are built to move in a direction that takes the common good. And I'm using the word common good both in its environmental sense as well as in a more generic sense. What I have found in my experience is that a charismatic leader really matters. It matters to have a leader that actually articulates a vision that is a vision that people have an easier time to go along with. The second thing that a charismatic leader has to do is not to do it top down, because you can't actually build a values-based organization if you insist on a value. It has to be much more consensus-based. It has to be something that you've got to build a social contract around those values. And there has to be a give a little and take a little on that. So you can't have a black and white set of values that everyone agrees with you. It has to be a co-creation of values within an organization. A third thing that I would say is that there have to be incentives. Incentives, and I'm talking about government, state organizations. I'm not talking about non-government. I have been trained in state organizations. I believe in the public sector. I know that that's where scale happens. And so how do you actually do it within public sector, say utilities, for instance? Well, you do it through building consensus, but you also do it through incentives. There are rewards and there are punishments or penalties to acting in certain ways. As we say to our toddlers often, you can feel the way you want, but you can't act the way you want. You've got to act in the common good. So your individual values, in a sense, don't necessarily always matter as long as you have signed on to a collective set of values. And so that collective set of values really matters. And then a final point that I do have a couple of others, but and I also realize I'm going over. But the final point I wanted to make here is that you can't suddenly bring a value out of nowhere. It has to be grounded within either that organization or a historical reality or a cultural reality in order for you to build upon something. Coming up with a value that no one has ever heard of it may not be impossible, but it's going to be a really, really uphill task. So let me stop there, Monica. I have a couple of other thoughts, but at some point later. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you've given us something to chew on. One thing in particular that I would like to go to Pablo for before we're concluding this piece. And Pablo, two questions to you here, because I think Maitri has just outed herself as not just a social justice warrior, but also as somebody who believes a lot in efficiency and rewards and getting stuff done and fast. And, you know, now from where you're sitting, you had to negotiate a lot with people who might have had different values or value systems, or with people who had values that you could associate with and that you felt were supportive of, say, larger sense of protecting nature or so, but who then kind of took a different curve, right? In practical terms, how does one maneuver such a space?
How much time do you have?
Well, short headlines.
You know, I mean, let me just around that to share with you that I think a way to answer that, a part of that, Maitri already said about it, and it is your style of leadership. If you want to generate trust, you have to be open, transparent, and you have to somehow give the example. So in a case of my own experience, and this is the only thing that I can talk about, Argentina is a very heterogeneous country. There are 24 provinces and very different cultures. I'm sure this is happening all over the place. So whenever you say something and you manage something that is so valuable for the economy and for the life of the people as water is, you are typically confronted with cynicism. So the whole idea is that this is only a saying, this is only a word, this is only a mouth speaking, and there are no realities behind it. So it is, as in many other fields of life, the way you lead is central to any kind of a value game in a way. So I fully agree on that. Let me add on top of that two more things. One is that time is also very important, and you need to listen, because what you're doing policies is aggregating values. You are aggregating perspectives and finding a common ground that is feasible for everybody. So it's very important to consider time. And also regarding time, I tend to believe that values also change according to the time frame. So you typically give more importance to your necessities and to the, so to say, market-oriented approach in the short term. Now, if you take people and organizations to look at the longer term, then you will easily get into the more fundamental values. So you have to practice that as well, not only playing with the shorter term, which is typically making a net profit in a short time frame, but also including within the incentives, including within the discussion, including within the policy frameworks, the longer term. And typically they are not there very clearly. They are only there in very broad statements. So if you want your fundamental values to be a part of it, you have to include within your policies and regulations in a very concrete, and if it is possible, even including numbers, what you are talking about when you are referring to a longer term, because people in the longer term tend to think in a much common way and similar way.
Thank you. And I think you've just given that, I don't know, 70% or so of our audience that comes from the nature solution side. A really great tip for how to create clusters of values when they are in groups for decision making, which is by bringing in a stronger perspective on the longer term developments. Now, both you and Maitre emphasize the notion of leadership. And I would love to now turn to someone who has shown enormous amounts of leadership in an organization that delivers water service. Meseret Asefa of the Addis Ababa Water and Sewage Authority. Meseret, you are one of those people that Pablo and Maitre were talking about. Somebody who works at the leadership level. In fact, you're directly advising the leadership of the Addis Ababa Water and Sewage Authority on an initiative that really draws on your personal values and the values that you share with others in the organization. Can you share a little bit more about your experience there, how to turn values into positive action? Meseret?
Yes, hi, thank you very much, Monica. In our case, which is specifically the field level leadership, is what happened in our case. So as you said, I work in a government institution which solely gives water service, renders water service for the city. We are the sole water providers in a government organization. So everything depends on us, whether we serve right or not. We directly affect the whole city. So in our case, what field level leadership did a great deal for us, because in its approach itself, it's very different, because it kind of relates to the whole change process from down to from bottom to up, not from the top to the bottom, because our leaders, the top leaders, chose to follow that direction because it hasn't been done before and it's very new. So what in my personal journey through FLA, so in the first place, I don't know if I have to talk about that. Can I talk about that?
Hey, this is about operationalizing values for decision making. So you're on.
Okay, so the first, I wasn't in this position when FLL started. I was just an expert in the institution when FLL started. So I was chosen to participate in the training abroad in India. So at that time, I was very surprised with why I was chosen, because I was just an expert, and I'm not used to trainings outside of the country, because I thought that all that was given to the higher officials and the leaders. So I was very surprised and apprehensive at the same time. But then I found some other people who were chosen like me, 18 other people. So some of them were just experts and some of them had some leadership roles. So we took the training and it was very surprising because the approach it took was very different from what we were used to. And we were very much interested with what it can bring to the institution. So when we came back, the management was very much surprised with the energy and the passion we displayed at the time, because we were very much eager to share what the approach can bring to the institution, and very much eager to train our peer groups. So what happened for me was back before FLL started, I've never given much thought to my values and what I would bring to the institution. And only thing I was focused was just to gain my salary. And I was a legal advisor, so I just do my job and go home, that's it. But then, and the people around me were not in any way engaged to talk about their values or what they would have bring to the institution. So I didn't get any chance to share anything with anyone. Although I felt like there was something lacking, like I haven't done what was supposed to be done while I was there, and there was dissatisfaction within me. I mean, I could have done some more. I could have contributed in some way while serving the community rather than just doing what I do and go home. So then when I met these other people who went to the training with me, they kind of felt like family, to tell you the truth. They have the same passion, the same energy, and the same driven attitude like me. They wanted to bring something to the institution, like something to change how the culture was being in the institution, to tell you the truth, in our case, you can hear a lot of negative energy, negative rumors, and all in the institution. People like that are very much connected towards each other, and people like me who doesn't listen to anything, any kind of rumors or talks or negative things, you don't get to communicate with people. So I was not that much out there. So then when FLL happened, I was able to find another 18 people who are so much like me, who would rather spend their time trying to create some change within my peer groups, rather than sitting down and talking some negative energy to the organization. So FLL for me brought that absolutely fantastic opportunity to meet these people, and then I was able to share with them my whole perspective on how we can bring change to the institution, how we can influence decision making, how we can change how things are being done in the institution. Because before FLL, I was dissatisfied with some decisions being carried out in the institution, and I had no platform at the time to bring it to the higher level officials. But now, thanks to FLL, I would say, I was also promoted to a leadership role, and I'm no longer an expert. I am also in a higher position right now. So it's very. I'm playing two roles right now. I'm also a new leader and also an FLL advocate, I would say, and giving the training itself right now. We're actually carrying out the training right now at this time. So the changes, I don't know if I can talk about that now, Monica.
Well, why don't we hear for a moment, before we go into the changes, from Sanjay, to understand what kind of program this actually is that you went through. with the sewage or water and sewage authority, because it's leaving me baffled when I'm hearing about, I think we all know the feeling, you work in a large organization, the major sentiment is negative. You want to contribute to positive change, but neither do you know where to start nor with whom. So you kind of keep your head down and do your job. And then something opens up the field for action. Sanjay Pahuja is a lead water resource management specialist with the World Bank, and I think now you're with West Africa, but at the time you were working with the Addis Ababa team. You want to tell us what is this field level leadership or FLL program?
Sure, thanks, Monica. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I want to pick up a few threads before describing very briefly what FLL is. And these are from what Chris and Lucas shared, and also Maitre and Pablo and Mesret's story. This fact has been there from the beginning of history, that in every place there are people who have a whole range of values. There are some who want to serve their communities, who work hard, who are honest, and the self-transcendence part that was shown on the values chart, and the others who only care about enriching themselves, their power, their career, their money. And we often think, oh, we can bring them all together. One finding from the values literature, values research, they are diametrically opposite. You cannot bring them together. You cannot take a mafia guy and make him a saint and vice versa. That's the first thing. However, what is the implication of this fact for us, in a very practical term, who work on design of programs, who want to improve how water is valued, how water is treated? Because we work a lot on programs, policies, new laws, setting up new institutions, hoping that they will change the situation. But those things are dead. They only come to life when there are people whose heart is in the right place, who care a lot, and when they have the power to do what they want to do. And that is where a person like Meseret, now she tells her story. She was a junior legal expert in AUSA. She said she felt lonely and alone. And what can be done to strengthen the people like Meseret? How many are there? Can we find them? And Meseret's story is also interesting because it's not just emotional support or courage that she felt when she found 18 other people in the same organization. It's also that as they exercised their voice, they grew. And today she's the secretary to the board of AUSA and the advisor to the general manager. So it's about power. It's about how do we shift the power to those who have the right values rather than changing the values of the people who don't have the right values, because that doesn't come.
So that's all very big and lofty. Can you just tell us also what concretely happened?
Yes. So in FLL, the idea is how to identify in large numbers in an organization people who have positive values, values that are aligned with the program you want to do or the services you want to deliver or the culture you want to create. And it targets the entire staff of organizations. So we're not just looking at top level leadership. If you have 4,000 people in your organization, FLL will include every single of those 4,000 people.
And what do they do?
It's implemented by a small group of staff who are chosen from the organization itself. They are trained as FLL coaches. And once they are trained, they come back to their organization and they run these workshops for their own colleagues in local language, using the local context. And the workshops are not about how to use this software or how do you operate the pumps. They are essentially psychology. They are therapy. You actually ask people and get a conversation going about what do you want to do in life? What makes you happy? What are you proud of when you tell your kids what you do at job? So we create this space for genuine reflection and self-assessment in small groups. And the big thing that happens in addition to reflection and self-assessment is that someone in that group of 30 staff who are in the workshop, they see someone else. They say, oh, this person talks like me. I'm inspired by what they are sharing. And this is the information problem that is always there. You do not know who else has the good values, who else wants to serve, because that's the information challenge. And once people find 2 or 3 of like-minded people, then there's nothing that we do anymore. They go and they connect with each other because they have been hungry for this kind of support, this kind of emotional small group network. So that is the basic power of FLL. Second thing, FLL is cheap and it's efficient. As I said, we cover thousands of people in the organizations, and it produces hundreds of change leaders within the organization. And the point is, once you were alone, now you find a couple of friends, your courage increases. So you exercise your voice. You start saying things that you believe in, and that starts sort of a social movement. It's not necessarily a training program, it becomes a social movement. And the very final point, FLL is provided through a peer-to-peer arrangement. So one public agency that has done FLL successfully, if they are willing, they will train another public agency. So Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority has conducted trainings for the water utility in Beira, Mozambique. They will be doing it for Ghana. So it's all public to public, peer to peer, south to south connections. I'll stop
Sanjay,
here.
what Pablo and Maitri were just saying it takes leaders, left me with this perspective, okay, I need to look up. What you guys are saying is there is a way of working at the organization level where you look left and right, and where you are, through this program, are being put in a position where you can actually see people left and right and then work with them. But before we know more about this, Meseret, you had offered to tell us what actually happened once you looked left and right. What were the results of this work, which presumably didn't happen in a day or so, but took, what, a few months? How long? And what happened?
So, yeah, we have been doing the training for a long time now. I think two years since we started doing it. We have a large number of employees, so we have to go a long way to cover all of them. But we trained like 1,000 employees so far, and we have 3,000 more to go. But even with the number of people we have trained so far, we have seen very inspiring results from the after they took the training. So one thing is individual changes, behavioral changes from employees. They became more committed because they have seen people who are who positively impacts them, and they are more they have been driven to do what was inside them from the beginning. So we have motivated them, we have driven them to act in a positive manner. So you see individual contributions. Like I have said this so many times. I have shared this story with other people also. There was a person who bought a water saving tool with her own resources. She was driven to do that to save water. She saw some wasting of water in a sludge transfer station, and so without waiting for any other person to finance the resources, she did it herself, and this was an inspiration for others who were around her. And also there were some inventions to save water, some with other employees also. And we also saw a teamwork spirit. That was what was actually the greater change we have observed. People now are gathered to work together. They have this common energy and common passion and common thinking to do more, to contribute more. So there's no longer the feeling of doing things alone, like being secluded in a specific department or a specific section. So you see people are moving in the same direction. So we have seen that distinctively. And with the numbers, we have seen some changes with the numbers. Like, for example, we have seen changes with the NRW, non-revenue water. We have been able to decrease that, and the revenue collection. We have also increased the percent of our revenue with that, and also some efficiency. We have also been efficient in the process. You know, we have seen people doing things efficiently than they were able to do it before. Actually, the World Bank has also done evaluations on that in 2 rounds, and the second round is also coming soon. You can also see those results. They were very much surprised when they did the evaluation, because even a year later, people who took the training a year later, who were interviewed a year later, talked about it in a very passionate manner, and it was embedded in them. So we have seen those changes in the institution.
Thank you. And thank you, Mehra, in particular for reminding us that results at the organization level aren't always only the hard data. Of course, they're important, the non-revenue water numbers going down, the improvements in efficiency going up, etc. But that the soft side of things on how people collaborate and how they relate to each other, they allow for a longer term perspective for improvements. Now, we're going to turn in a moment now to you, our audience who is still here, asking you a question related to that. But before we do this, I can imagine some of our 70 strong audience wondering, kind of, you know, in the spirit of Ghostbusters, thinking about the negativity busters. So whom are you going to call? Sanjay, where do people turn to? Is there a place, or is this still under development? Is there, you know, is there an easy fix, or does it take time? What should somebody who's listening and is inspired by what Meseret says and wants to try this out, what should they do? Where should they go?
So we have 2 training centers now, one in Chennai, one in Addis Ababa. More will be coming up, especially in other languages for French-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries. The demand has grown quite a bit beyond the capacity for supply, but we are also trying to scale up to come up to this new level of business. And in the meantime, we also putting out a FLL guide that will be released shortly. But in the meantime, I'm going to put my email address here. Sorry, we don't have a structure yet, an institutional setup that can systematically do this. But if you are curious, if you are interested, we can put you in touch with these 2 institutions which can provide FLL training and support. And I'll put my email right there in the chat right now.
Thank you. Now, let us hear from everybody in this session. I'd love to hear your answer to the question, can you yourself see yourself participate in a discussion about your personal values in the workplace or in the political arena that you operate in? Can you see yourself encourage such a discussion on a scale from 0 to 6, 0 not at all, and 6 yes, by all means, let's get started. This may take courage. This is perhaps unusual. It may lead to an inflation of values, who knows? Would love to hear where you are in this. Do you find this too risky, too kind of soft thing, you know, not technical enough, not data driven enough? Maybe we have too many engineers here, or in fact, from what I understand from Meseret, it's actually the engineers that really jump on that values work that what I have learned over the last couple of months. So I can see quite a lot of enthusiasm here in our room. I'd love to try this. So we're not all jumping immediately on the ship, but many people would love to try it, right? We've got no one yet who says, not at all, that sounds crazy. Okay, so presumably because you switched onto a session that has values in the title, you're kind of open to some of that. But it looks like you're interested. So take down Sanjay's email, and I hope, Sanjay, you're going to not wake up tomorrow to a flood of emails. But we can definitely start creating a discussion group around that so that we get this. Second question. Let's go to the second question if we can. Eva, if you could do that now. I'm not sure whose slide we're here seeing. The second question is, do we need to create more space for values-based dialogue in your view, based on where you're working? Also in view of the systemic changes that our societies face. Do we need more space for that? Again, on a scale from 0 to 6. Oops, that's not the question that I had here. Okay.
Could you maybe let me know what number the question was you're referring to?
Okay, that was, in my view, it was the last one, but maybe I took something down incorrectly, which is very possible. Sorry. So, but that one is even more interesting here. I can see that the idea of co-workers to inspire each other sounds really resonating with you and your organizations. Okay, then do we still have that last question about creating space for, maybe that question has disappeared. On the very bottom.
Influence.
Yes, here we go. So do we all need more space for that? Because let's not forget, we have somebody from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs here who is co-hosting the work on the large UN water conference next spring, something where I'm actually wondering how values will play out there. And maybe we can send Martin off with a mandate from our session to create more space for values-based dialogue. And so if you would like to give your view on this, that would be a great moment now to do so. So I can see we have a lot of values aficionados here in the group. We've got 9 more minutes. There is a chat function in the session here where we had a couple of people already ask questions. I'd like to ask Christopher, can you please briefly respond to the 2 questions that related to the survey? One was about, is there like an age correlation with the answers? And another one was in regard to the indicators. Very briefly, Christopher, so that we can then do a very quick final round.
Sure. So in fact, I wrote a very quick written response as well to the indicators question. So we designed them ourselves. We had to think of ways to put these opinions or thoughts about water policy in the most general terms. So maybe we asked, should water utilities be managed by the state, or should they be managed privately? That is one example where you could imagine a values footprint in your preference, whether water should be managed privately or publicly. And like this, we had quite a long list of different questions, and anyone who is interested more in it, I actually recommend taking the survey. It will be the best way to see the indicators that informed our results. And for being quick, the second question on correlation to age, I do think Luke has tested that. I don't think in our specific survey there was a correlation, but I do know from previous studies that usually younger people tend to score higher on things like environmentally friendly. And as you age, that becomes a little bit less. Also women, people with more formal education. But I cannot say that for our survey. That is not what we tested in our case.
Okay, thank you. Now, let me then come with another question that came from the audience here. And I would like to throw that both to Lucas and to Pablo, respectively 1-sentence answers, please. And that is about the notion of whether people change their values easily or not. I think we've heard in the last hour and a bit different perspectives on that. And Lucas, do they change or do they not? What does theory and research tell us?
Yeah, research says they're quite stable. They can change, for example, motherhood, maternity changes or increases conservation values. But generally, they're quite stable. But they can be applied. I think we've heard that as well in the discussion. They can be applied differently to different situations and can play more or less of a role depending on the situation.
And if I could just follow up, it seems they can be newly clustered, is what some of this is. But maybe you want to think about that question while I'm going to Pablo. Pablo, you have maintained that people change their values based on conversations, based on learning something along the way, maybe along the lifetime. What would you say now that we've heard from Lucas?
My experience is that people change their values in the short term, the short-term values, you can change them because they are very much regarding the current situation, the context of the possibilities they can get. And the longer terms are much difficult to change, which is
So
fine.
the short-term one would be winning the next election, getting the next promotion, getting that deal through, right?
Absolutely. Getting a project regarding water, getting some kind of new license from the government, those kind of things that are very much short-term, and they have to do with necessities typically. There was a comment in the chat also regarding the Maslow pyramid, and that has a lot to do with that. I mean, you cannot compare the situation in a very affluent society with a country that is a developing country, because in those situations, the short term actually has a way more, in many cases, I think, it has way more weight than the longer term. So if you are leading in that situation, you have to be able to show the consequences and to bring the longer term back to the reality, because it is very far away from many people, but it is a comment only.
Thank you. And I think we also need to be careful to not confuse values with objectives, right? Because values are what drives your objectives in the end. And it allows us to make choices between different objectives. It's the values. And I think this is where Lucas comes in with what's the real driver. Now, one quick last word from all of you. We've got 4 minutes before we'll be shut down. One question is, is there something you can do to apply a values lens in bringing for better decisions in what you're doing, and what would that be? And I'm going to start with Martin. Is there something, a place, a location, a process where you want to bring a values lens stronger than you have beforehand? Martin.
No, definitely. And you already mentioned the UN 2023. Of course, that is a moment where a lot of initiative and energy can come together. And I think that would be a great place to articulate demand for such an approach, but also to articulate commitment. We in our organization, we would like to do this, and we're working with the World Bank to try and develop a mechanism to scale up FLL. But I think in the FLL family, there are other kinds of initiatives that could be scaled. So it would be great to build a community around this and to, get on the stage at UN 2023 on 22 to 24 March.
Let's not forget, you also have the Valuing Water initiative, for which we can type the link in that will be. Yeah,
we'll show the slide of the Valuing Water initiative and contact details at the end of the session.
Which is in 2 minutes. Christopher and Lucas, are you going to do more research in this or less?
In fact, we have already done more research, and you can expect more reports. But generally, I just wanted to comment, I think the best place for these conversations are multi-stakeholder platforms where you can exchange about values. That is really my own recommendation.
Right. Lucas.
Yeah, very much agree. I'm sort of coming from I don't want to make this take too long, but
you can't, because we only have 2 more minutes.
I know.
Are you going to do more research? Yes or no?
Definitely a lot more research. Yeah, absolutely. Focusing more on the common good, on shared values, what we have in common, is definitely something I'm doing quite a lot. Yeah.
So more to come on the common good there. Pablo, taking the values lens to where?
Well, I think GWP, Global Water Partnership. I think there is a huge need for reshape the global water agenda, and it has to be based on values. So I fully appreciate all this discussion, and GWP will be going that way.
Thank you. Maitri?
I'm going to give a nerdy answer. I actually would really like to see much more of a teasing out of the conceptual side of what does values mean. Values mean different things to different people. Even just the word values means different things to different people. So I would really like to see a shared understanding of what values mean, and then better measurement, which is multidisciplinary. We said multi-stakeholder in terms of the values lens, but also in terms of the research and the data, it just needs to be a lot more multidisciplinary. And those disciplines that talk less about values need to be able to absorb the fact that values actually drive action.
Thank you. And they're going to switch us off. So I'm going to say thank you to Meseret and Sanjay, because we know what you're doing on values. You're taking it into the water utilities. Let me conclude by saying thank you to everyone and to all our listeners, because we're going to be switched off now. Take a look here at the Valuing Water Initiative. I think the team can make connections for you when you go through there. And thank you to the very many participants that have stayed with us for the last hour and 20 minutes. And thank you to our wonderful team, our wonderful panel here. Have a good evening, day, night, morning, wherever you are. And let's value the time and the water we have.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.